Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on most of the major podcast platforms, and we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. My guest for this four-part series is Rachel Friars. Rachel is a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'll be speaking with Rachel about her PhD topic, Neo-Victorianism and 19th century lesbian literature and history, and how she uses primary sources to support her work. Rachel's other research interests include life writing, historical fiction, true crime, popular culture, and the Gothic. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM. In this second episode, we learn about the diaries of Anne Lister and why they're so important to queer history and Rachel's research. Further, Rachel explains the benefits of researching primary sources in a digital format and why, no matter what format they're in, archives demand a slower pace. You've talked about Anne Lister quite a bit so far. I'm wondering if we can kind of dig in a little bit more into who she was and her, and have you explain her diaries in a little bit more detail and why they're so important to your research, or in general, really, historically.
Yes, I would. I love talking about Anne Lister, and I have to rein myself in so that I don't wax on, because there is truly so much to say. But as I said, Anne Lister was born in 1791. Really interesting time in history, right? If we think of the French Revolution, we think of a lot of political moving and shaking going on. And she was a fascinating woman. She was a fascinating child and young adult, and grew up to be one of the most significant historical figures in my mind for queer history and history in general. So she was interesting for a couple of reasons. One reason was because she ended up being the person who owned her own estate, basically. She inherited her own estate. So if we think about the 19th century and we think of the laws of patrilineal inheritance, usually estates go to the first son, the oldest son. Anne Lister was such that she was so brilliant, so educated, so powerful as a woman that she inherited this estate. So she's landed, and she has a lot of social power because of that. She was also very, very interested in education. She was a huge reader, she loved anatomy, she loved the classics. I mean, a lot of her diaries detail her readings on various subjects and her travels. She was a world traveler. She was climbing mountains. She was meeting royalty from all over the world. I mean, she truly was this powerhouse of adventure, I think, is how I would describe her. She was also a lesbian, and so she was very introspective about her sexuality. She was very devoted to the women she was involved with, and much of her diaries detail her various attachments. So some of those attachments were very significant. Some of them were very casual. Her first really significant relationship, one that kind of carries throughout her life, is her relationship with Mariana Lawton, who gets married when she and Lister are very young, and that breaks Lister's heart. And she kind of never quite recovers from that heartbreak, although her and Mariana remain close for most of her life after that. So those relationships are detailed in specific. Her sexual relationships are detailed in specific. And so it truly is over millions of words in her diaries, because she started around maybe 1810, maybe 1806, very early in her life. She started writing these diaries, and they become more prolific, more sophisticated as she writes, as she grows up. And she was writing right up until her very sudden death in 1840. So those diaries are enormous. The archive is enormous, millions of words.
Wow.
And she wrote those diaries with the impression that she didn't want anyone else to read them. So most of them, especially her lesbian relationships, are written in code. It's her own private code. She designed it. And for a long time, no one could figure it out. And for a long time, the diaries were actually hidden. So the code is really interesting because it provides a veil or a layer through which we have to actually work through in order to understand what those diaries are saying. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that the diaries are hugely important, and the archive, the digitized archive of those diaries, is crucial for queerless history and lesbian history.
Yep. So, a question about the coding method that she used. Despite the fact that she, obviously she wasn't writing her diaries for public consumption. Nevertheless, can you explain, to the extent that like why she used the code? Was that just in case they got into the wrong hands, or?
Yeah, I think it was just in case is a very
Yeah.
good way to say it.
Yeah.
I know that she taught the code to Mariana, for example. So there are letters exchanged between the two of them in the code. So that's like a very clear indication to us that, okay, so there's a desire to obscure the content of the letters from the wrong hands, i.e., potentially Charles Lawton, her husband, Mariana's husband. So we know that it is a just in case sort of thing, but these diaries are very much written for herself. And we also know that through references, like she indexes a lot through symbols. So we know, for example, when she sent a letter or when she received a letter, she has little symbols for that. And so those are for her reference. So the
Yeah.
code is very much readable to her, and it's for her reference. So I think it's an
Right.
obscuring mechanism. I think it's a privacy mechanism, but it doesn't apply to herself. She's not trying to hide something from herself.
Right. Sort of also an organizational method
Very
as well, I
much.
guess. Yeah.
Yes, very much. Especially with the symbols. And I mean, again,
Hmm.
she has symbols for if she's had sex that day, she has a symbol for that.
Right.
So, and eventually she contracts a venereal disease. And she has a symbol for when she applies treatment for that. So it's just
Huh.
interesting
Yeah.
you can see really what mattered to her to keep
Hmm.
track of.
Right. So you mentioned that the diaries have been digitized. Can you explain some of the benefits of researching these documents in a digitized format?
Yes, the benefits of researching these documents through digital archives is enormous because
Hmm.
the diaries are huge. There are many of them. They're written in code. They're even when they're written in English or in handwriting, her handwriting is very hard to read, very tiny. You know, she's a typical early 19th century woman. She's using every aspect of that page because paper is expensive. So they're difficult to read. And so the digitized versions of the diaries, which have been scanned and put online, all very organized, are great because they're so high resolution that you can go right up to a single word and pore over it until you figure out what it says. And you can also take yourself through the code much more easily because the code has no punctuation and has no spaces between words. So there's no indication. It really, really, really rejects the readerly eye. So
Hmm.
the digitized format really helps to figure out where you're at in the diaries. And again, because, and we'll talk about this, because now with the Adam Matthews Sex and Sexuality Archive, we have
Right.
HDR, we have handwritten text recognition. We can also search inside those diaries, and that's an enormous help when you're looking for like truly, truly a needle in a haystack in trying to find something very specific from a very specific time in her life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you specifically about Adam Matthews' Sex and Sexuality module, and how that helped you improve your workflow, basically, in doing your research.
Yeah, the Sex and Sexuality Archive was really helpful because when I first started researching Ann Lister and when I first started engaging with the diaries, I was going directly to the source, which is the West Yorkshire Archive Service. And they, not only do they house the Lister diaries, but they also house everything else that is involved in the Lister estate. So already it's a bit, I don't want to say like polluted or anything like that, but it's obscured by the larger Lister archive. So in the sex and sexuality database, the Lister diaries stand alone, and they're also placed in such a way so as to identify very specifically which diary you're looking at from which year and what time it spans. But, and what's very exciting to me is that you can go into that diary and you can flip through the pages as if it was in front of you, which is not something that you're able to do on the West Yorkshire Archive Service, to my knowledge. It's very much a page by page loading HTML website. So this is much more exciting because it gives it a lot more of a book feel, if that makes sense. It feels like it's in front of you, and it feels like it's a whole. So you're not looking page by page. Well, you are looking page by page, but you can flip through that diary from the front cover, which is also, of course, scanned all the way to the back cover. So that's exciting. And as I said, because of the HDR, the handwritten text recognition, we can search within those diaries for words in each individual diary. And so it makes it so much easier to find things. It also makes it easier to read or check her handwriting, because it's very hard to read, and you have to sort of sink into her life in order to be able to recognize her writing right away. And it's like having another language. It's like learning another language. If you don't do it every day, if you don't use it every day, you start to forget. And so sometimes I'll come back to her and I'm like, whoa, I used to know this, and now I can't remember. So I think that Sex and Sexuality Archive, just through the tools and the way that it's organized, it's much easier, and it has improved my workflow, and that allows me to go faster in as much as I can go fast in an archive.
Right.
So I think that I feel like it was like the dawn of a new day when I started approaching it through this database rather than through the West Yorkshire Archives.
Yeah, excellent. So you've sprinkled some language throughout, as you describe, working in archives. Sort of sinking yourself into Ann Lister's life and things like that. And I'm curious. I mean, certainly digital digitization certainly allows for more efficient, research and workflows. But I'm curious about the flip side. Archives don't always provide instant gratification, so to speak. In what ways do archives kind of demand a slower pace in doing your research?
Yeah, archives are, like I said before, sometimes archives reject the readerly eye, or they resist the readerly eye. And so that's not to say that we shouldn't read them, but it means that we have to sort of force our way in or work our way in a way that, like I said, the secondary source doesn't necessarily do, because it's meant for you to read. It's meant for you to encounter it in a particular context. So the archive requires a slowing down, getting to know it, I think, which is a bit of a personified way of thinking about archives. But really, by the time you spend enough time with some of these collections and some of these databases, it is like getting to know someone. It is like feeling you know someone, because you're reading, in some cases, their private thoughts. So I think when you're encountering handwriting in specific, when you're encountering just the way archives are organized, that's, a really, really important part of archival work and archival study. How do we organize this material? Especially, and sometimes it comes in just a box, thrown in a box. And so there's a lot of work that goes into organizing stuff for my viewing once I see it on the screen that I don't see, but the archivists are working on doing for me. So I think that archives truly do demand their own approach. And I think even before you start reading the material, reading around to see how things are organized, to see the dates, to see where you can find things or how to read things, is all important before you even get to the text at hand. And I think that wedding of two different worlds is really important when thinking about what archives demand from you as a researcher.
You just heard from Rachel Friars, a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Join us next week as Rachel talks about primary source literacy, particularly how each archive has its own unique demands, why you can't take a primary source at face value, and the importance of archive citation. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM.
I tell my students that all sources are valuable as long as you cite them and as long as you're thinking about them in the right way. And so that's something we have to teach and learn. But it's crucial when we come to archives because archives have a specific narrative, right? They're organized in a specific way and they're presented to us, like thinking about maybe the closed form of the diary, they're presented to us in a specific way. So it's crucial to sort of not allow, like, again, Lister as an example, something she believed in 1820 might not be what she believes in 1835. So that context is important, and to make a statement that contradicts that or that assumes a through line of belief in the diaries of this lived person who wrote for decades, that's to me, I think that is a bit of a risk.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.